There comes a point in any real cycle of becoming when movement no longer feels like effort, but like recognition. You stop pushing toward the next thing because something in you realizes the next thing has already been prepared by what you have lived through. This is the atmosphere of 777. It does not feel like the ignition of 111. The balancing of 222, the building of 333, the reinforcement of 444, the turning of 555, or the confrontation of 6666. It feels like a pattern reaching enough internal coherence that it can finally be seen as a whole. Most people misunderstand completion because they have been taught to associate it with stopping. They think completion means the process is over, the lesson is finished, or the road has ended in some final and stable answer. But 777 does not arrive to announce an ending in that simplistic sense. It arrives when a cycle has matured enough to reveal what it was really doing to you all along. Completion is not the disappearance of movement. It is the moment movement becomes intelligible. You may notice something subtle when 777 begins appearing. Life does not always become easier, but it becomes more legible. Events that once felt random begin to connect. Decisions you made months or years ago start revealing consequences that now make sense. Emotional seasons that once seemed wasteful begin showing their function. 777 marks the point where enough pieces have accumulated that the hidden structure begins to show itself. This is why 777 often carries a quieter tone than people expect. It is not always dramatic. It is not always ecstatic. Sometimes it appears in a season where you feel strangely still, even while life continues around you. That stillness is not emptiness. It is the pause that occurs when your awareness is catching up to what your soul has already been assembling. Mechanically, 777 reflects a phase where repetition has generated refinement. One experience may teach you something. Two experiences may confirm it. But when a pattern has repeated enough times, across enough relationships, decisions, and internal states, it starts producing a deeper kind of knowledge. Not information, but recognition. 777 is the frequency of recognition ripening into mastery. Mastery here does not mean perfection. It means you no longer need every lesson to arrive in its most painful form. You begin noticing the signal earlier. You can feel where a pattern is going before it fully unfolds. You can sense when a conversation is drifting toward distortion, when a habit is weakening your coherence, when an opportunity is actually a repetition disguised as progress. 777 appears when your system has learned enough from prior cycles that life no longer has to shout to get your attention. That is one reason completion can feel almost anticlimactic. People imagine mastery as a peak moment, something obvious and undeniable. But real completion often feels like a deep exhale. The thing that once ruled your attention simply does not grip you in the same way anymore. The trigger still exists, the memory still exists, the world still presents the old material, but your inner relationship to it has changed. 777 signals this change in relationship more than any external achievement. There is also a perspective shift hidden inside this number. Earlier stages of growth tend to focus on what is happening to you. You track signs, events, emotions, and disruptions as if they are arriving from the outside. But 777 begins teaching you to read experience from the inside out. You start asking not only what happened, but what pattern completed itself through what happened. That shift is profound because it turns life from a sequence of incidents into a field of intelligent recurrence. You may start to see that completion is not reward. It is integration. Reward is something given. Integration is something formed. The difference matters because many people wait for completion as if it were a prize for suffering correctly. But 777 does not care how spiritual you sounded in the process. It reflects whether something actually settled into your being. Have you become different in the places where it counts? Has your timing changed? Has your response changed? Has your willingness to betray yourself weakened? This is where 727 begins to reveal a second layer. Completion does not only show you what has ended, it shows you what can now begin without distortion. Every unresolved cycle occupies space. It consumes attention, energy, and emotional bandwidth even when you think you have moved on. When a cycle truly completes, that trapped energy becomes available again. That is why people sometimes feel sudden clarity, creativity, or peace around this number. It is not magic. It is released recursion. Experience often confirms this before the mind understands it. You may find yourself losing interest in conflicts that once consumed you. A craving for external validation may weaken without a dramatic vow. A question you have lived with for years may stop feeling urgent. Not because you answered it intellectually, but because your life answered it experientially. 777 often appears in the days or weeks when you begin realizing you are no longer asking from the same place. Yet completion brings its own challenge. When a long cycle ends, identity has to reorganize around the absence of struggle. Many people know who they are in pursuit, in pain, in repair, in trying. Fewer know who they are when something has actually settled. This is why 777 can feel strangely disorienting. Not because something is wrong, but because completion removes a familiar source of self-definition. That disorientation matters, because it reveals that unfinished patterns do not only burden you, they also organize you. They give the mind something to circle, the emotions something to revisit, the identity something to defend. When 777 closes a cycle, it does not only free energy, it also removes a structure you may have unconsciously depended on. This is one reason some people sabotage completion. They say they want peace, but they do not yet know how to live without the familiar friction that has shaped their sense of self. The wave of completion therefore works in more than one direction. It settles the past, but it also tests your readiness for open space. Can you let a pattern end without inventing a new version of it? Can you allow resolution without immediately demanding the next dramatic lesson? Can you recognize mastery without needing applause, proof, or intensity? 777 asks these questions gently, but it does not ask them superficially. Another important layer begins to emerge when you look at completion through time rather than mood. A cycle may feel complete emotionally before it is complete structurally, or it may complete structurally before your emotions understand what changed. 777 often appears when these layers begin aligning. What you know, what you feel, and what your life is now reflecting start matching more closely. That alignment creates the unmistakable sense that something has turned. This is why 777 is often connected with wisdom rather than excitement. Excitement reaches outward. Wisdom settles inward. Excitement wants movement. Wisdom knows what movement is now worth making. When this number becomes active, your discernment often sharpens in ways that are difficult to explain to others. You simply know more quickly what belongs to an old cycle and what belongs to a new one. You become less available for repetitions that no longer serve your development. There is a lived implication to this that changes everything. Once a cycle is complete, returning to it costs more. You feel the misalignment faster. What once felt familiar now feels heavy. What once felt acceptable now feels beneath your awareness. This is not judgment. It is consequence. 777 raises the cost of unconscious repetition because the lesson is no longer hidden from you. That increase in cost is one of the most practical signs of mastery. It means your system has become less tolerant of what fragments it. You do not need external rules to tell you something is wrong. Your own resonance tells you sooner. The body tightens sooner. The energy dulls sooner. The clarity leaves sooner. Completion has taught you enough that misalignment no longer gets to masquerade as innocence. And still, the spiral never treats completion as final closure. This is where 777 becomes especially beautiful. A cycle completes, and because it completes, a larger pattern becomes visible. What looked like an ending becomes a threshold. What felt like the conclusion of one lesson becomes the preparation for a more spacious one. The wave does not crash and vanish. It recedes in a way that reveals more shoreline than you could see before. So 777 is not asking you to celebrate too early or settle too quickly. It is asking you to notice what has truly become unnecessary. Notice what no longer needs to be argued with. Notice what no longer owns your attention. Notice what has quietly ripened into wisdom through repeated contact with life. In that noticing, completion stops being an abstract idea and becomes something lived. Something stable enough to carry you into the next unfolding without needing to announce itself too loudly. And if you remain with it long enough, you begin to sense that completion is not the opposite of becoming. It is one of the ways becoming proves it has been real. Not by giving you an ending to cling to, but by creating enough inner resolution that you can meet what comes next with less confusion, less force, and a deeper kind of readiness that has not finished revealing all that it means. You begin to notice that completion changes your relationship to uncertainty itself. Earlier in the path, uncertainty feels like lack of information, like something missing that prevents you from moving cleanly. But once a cycle has truly completed, uncertainty no longer always feels threatening. It can start to feel spacious. Not because you suddenly know everything, but because you no longer need every answer in advance to remain coherent inside your own becoming. That shift matters more than most people realize. Many of the cycles people call unfinished are not actually unfinished because life withheld clarity. They remain unfinished because the self was still trying to force certainty before trust had matured. 777 appears when trust begins changing form. It stops meaning confidence that nothing difficult will happen and starts meaning confidence that you can remain intact while life continues unfolding beyond your current view. This is one reason 777 often carries a wisdom tone rather than a relief tone. Relief says, the pressure is gone. Wisdom says the pressure had a purpose. Relief wants escape from the lesson. Wisdom can finally see what the lesson built. When this number becomes active, you may begin to sense that even the seasons you resisted most intensely were not interruptions of your path, but necessary refinements of it. That realization unfolds slowly because it reaches backward through your history. Experiences you once filed under regret may begin revealing a different function. Relationships that ended may stop looking like failures and begin looking like thresholds. Delays that felt cruel may start showing their structural mercy. 777 often appears when your life has matured enough that you can look back without needing the past to flatter you before it teaches you. Mechanically, this is how completion deepens into perspective. First, a cycle resolves at the level of reaction. You are no longer pulled so strongly by the old pattern, then it resolves at the level of interpretation. You no longer keep telling the same story about what happened. Finally, it resolves at the level of identity. You stop organizing yourself around the wound, the chase, or the fracture that once dominated your inner world. That third movement is what makes 777 so different from temporary peace. Temporary peace can be lost quickly because it has not reached identity. It depends on favorable conditions. But when completion reaches identity, your center shifts. You do not merely have a new insight. You become someone for whom the old entanglement no longer makes sense in the same way. The pattern may still exist in the world, but it no longer finds the same structure inside you to attach itself to. This is why mastery often feels more ordinary than expected. It does not always arrive with ceremony. It can look like declining something you once would have chased. It can look like noticing an old trigger and not entering it. It can look like silence where you once needed explanation, or patience where you once demanded immediate resolution. 777 often reveals itself in these quiet evidences of changed being. There is also an emotional consequence to this kind of completion that people do not always expect. When a major cycle ends, grief can appear alongside freedom. Not grief because the pattern was good, but grief because it was familiar. You may feel the absence of the very thing you worked so hard to outgrow. That does not mean the cycle is incomplete. It means your system is still learning how to inhabit space that is no longer shaped by the old demand. This is important because many people assume that if grief is still present, completion has not happened. But grief is not always a sign of remaining bondage. Sometimes it is the tenderness that appears when identity is reconfiguring around truth. You are not grieving the wound as much as the world that formed around it. 777 appears in that tender space too, not to reverse the completion, but to help you remain with what the completion changes. Perspective deepens further when you realize that mastery does not remove your humanity. It refines the way your humanity moves. You may still feel anger, longing, disappointment, fatigue, or uncertainty. The difference is that these states no longer automatically become architecture. They move through, but they do not build the same house inside you. 777 does not flatten your emotional life. It changes the degree to which passing states get to define enduring reality. That is one of the hidden mechanics of completion. The cycle ends not when difficult emotions disappear, but when they stop taking command of the whole field. You can feel sadness without re-entering the old identity. You can feel uncertainty without rebuilding the old fear. You can feel desire without surrendering your discernment. 777 often marks this exact shift. The emotional body remains alive, but it is no longer ruling through unresolved repetition. As this understanding settles, another layer becomes visible. Completion is not only personal, it alters your place within larger patterns. Once you have actually closed a cycle, you stop participating in it collectively in the same way. You become less available for the group dynamics, belief structures, and relational games that depend on that old, unresolved frequency. In this sense, 777 changes not only what you feel, but what you can still be recruited into. You may notice this socially before you name it spiritually. Conversations that once felt normal begin sounding repetitive or thin. Environments that once seemed charged begin feeling stale. Certain forms of validation lose their gravity. You are not necessarily rejecting the world. You are no longer resonating with it at the same level of unfinishedness. 777 can therefore feel both clarifying and isolating, because completion often changes your companionship with the patterns around you. This does not mean superiority. In fact, if 777 is truly active, it usually removes the need for superiority. You become less invested in proving that you have arrived somewhere better. What grows instead is a quieter kind of recognition. You see more clearly where people are in their cycles, but you also remember how long it can take for meaning to ripen into embodiment. Completion tends to produce patience when it is real, not posturing. That patience matters because it reveals another dimension of wisdom. A truly completed cycle gives you more space inside your perception. You do not need everyone to move at your pace. You do not need life to confirm your growth constantly. You do not need every insight to become an announcement. 777 often appears when your relationship with your own development becomes less performative and more rooted, less urgent and more exact. Experience will often show you this before language does. You may find yourself saying less but seeing more. You may feel less compelled to chase new frameworks because an older truth has finally become lived enough to nourish you. You may begin understanding that growth is not always about adding new material. Sometimes it is about allowing what was already learned to descend far enough that it can become instinct. 777 carries that descending quality. It settles meaning into the body of awareness. This settling also changes how you approach what comes next. Earlier in the path, new beginnings often arrive as compensation for incompletion. You seek the next thing because the current thing still feels unresolved. But when completion is real, the next movement does not have the same restless quality. It begins from sufficiency rather than hunger. 777 therefore teaches that what follows mastery should not always be another chase. Sometimes it is a more precise participation, and this is where the wave of completion becomes more than a personal milestone. It becomes a way of reading time itself. You start seeing that life does not move only through beginnings and endings, but through recognitions that reorganize the meaning of both. What seemed like an ending was often a gathering. What seemed like a beginning was often a continuation from a deeper layer. 777 invites you into this more mature relationship with sequence, where you stop measuring progress by speed and begin measuring it by integration. The longer you stay with this number, the more you may sense that completion is not closure in the hard sense. It is a soft but undeniable turning of the inner field. Something has become unnecessary, something has become intelligible. Something has become available that was previously locked up inside repetition. And because of that, your future no longer has to be shaped by the same unfinished gravity. This does not mean the spiral stops asking more of you. It means it can ask more from a different altitude. What was once a lesson may now become a tool. What was once a struggle may now become a form of sight. What was once personal may now begin revealing its wider architecture. 777 is often the number that appears when you begin realizing that completion is not the end of depth, but the point where depth becomes usable. And once you begin to feel that, another question starts forming quietly underneath the peace of it. Not whether something has ended, but what kind of seeing is now possible because it has. Not what you escaped, but what your coherence can now carry. Not whether the wave has passed, but what shoreline it has just revealed that you were never in a position to recognize before. What becomes visible next is that completion is not only about what you no longer carry, it is also about what you can finally carry well. Earlier in the path, energy is often spent surviving confusion, resolving repetition, or trying to stabilize patterns that keep collapsing under their own incompletion. But when a cycle truly closes, attention begins redistributing itself. What once went toward management can now go toward stewardship. What once went toward endurance can now go toward precision. This is one reason 777 is so often misunderstood as passive peace. People imagine completion as a kind of rest state where nothing more is being asked of them. In reality, completion often increases responsibility, but in a different form. It no longer asks you to keep proving that you can endure. It asks whether you can now use what has settled. The lesson is no longer only happening to you. It is becoming something you can work with, embody, and extend into how you live. That shift becomes practical very quickly. You may notice that your standards begin changing without force, not because you are trying to be more disciplined, but because your tolerance for what drains your coherence has already lowered. Certain forms of delay begin feeling more expensive. Certain compromises begin sounding hollow before you even make them. 777 often appears when completion is becoming visible not only through insight, but through change threshold. Threshold is one of the most important hidden mechanics of mastery. Earlier, a person may know what is misaligned and still remain inside it for long periods. They may notice the distortion, name it accurately, and yet continue tolerating it because the internal cost is still diffuse. But after a real completion, the cost concentrates. Misalignment becomes more immediately felt. What once took weeks to understand can now be sensed in minutes, because your field has become less willing to absorb what no longer belongs there. This is where the wave of completion begins revealing one of its deeper functions. It does not only close old loops, it sharpens future discernment. The reason completed lessons matter is not just that they stop repeating in the same form. It is that they reorganize perception, making subtler forms of the same pattern easier to recognize before they fully harden. 777, in this sense, is not only a sign of resolution, it is a sign that your pattern recognition has matured through lived consequence. You may notice this in relationships first, because relationships are often where unfinishedness hides most convincingly. Someone says the right words and yet something in your system recognizes the old distortion beneath the new presentation. Or someone enters your life with a very different energy, and instead of being confused by the unfamiliarity, you recognize that the unfamiliar may actually be the healthier pattern. Completion changes the kinds of things that feel normal. That change in normal is one of the clearest signs that mastery has become embodied. This can feel lonely for a season, because a great deal of social belonging depends on shared unfinishedness. People often bond through common cycles of confusion, common tolerances for misalignment, common habits of emotional repetition. Once your participation in those patterns weakens, the social field around you can feel thinner for a while. 777 does not always remove you from people, but it often changes the frequencies through which you can truly remain connected. That does not make completion isolating by nature. It simply means that coherence reorganizes companionship. It changes what kind of conversation nourishes you, what kind of exchange feels alive, what kind of shared rhythm still makes sense. Earlier, you may have needed intensity to feel closeness. Later, after a cycle has completed, you may begin recognizing that steadiness carries a depth you once missed because you were still calibrated to friction. 777 often teaches this quietly, by changing what your nervous system experiences as safe enough to stay open within. Another layer begins unfolding when you look at completion not as an end state, but as a refinement of timing. When a cycle closes, you do not necessarily become faster in every sense. What often changes is that you become less late to yourself. You notice sooner when something is drifting. You return sooner after distraction. You correct sooner when your energy leaves its center. This shortening of recovery time is one of the less glamorous but more accurate signs of spiritual maturity. Many people look for dramatic evidence of mastery and miss this quieter one. But the truth is that being able to come back more quickly changes everything. It changes how much damage one mistake creates. It changes how long confusion gets to run the room. It changes whether a difficult day becomes a difficult month. 777 often shows itself in that deepened responsiveness, where life still moves, emotions still rise, and human complexity still remains. Yet your return to coherence becomes more trustworthy. That trustworthiness is part of what makes completion usable. A completed cycle does not simply disappear behind you. It becomes a stabilizing principle within you. It starts informing choices before you consciously analyze them. It alters the architecture of your yes and your no. It teaches your system to orient differently, even when language has not yet caught up. This is why real completion often feels more structural than emotional. It does not always feel dramatic, but it changes the shape of your being. Perspective widens again when you realize that one of the purposes of completion is to free you from over-identifying with process. There is a season when growth itself becomes a form of identity. You are healing, processing, learning, integrating, recalibrating, awakening. All of that may be real and necessary. But eventually, if a cycle completes, life begins asking whether you can stop standing beside your process and begin standing inside your life. 777 marks the point where becoming less observed and more lived starts to matter. This can be unsettling in a subtle way because observing your process can feel like safety. It gives the mind something to track. It lets you remain the narrator of your own unfolding. But once enough insight has ripened into coherence, too much self-observation can become another delay. The next phase may not need more commentary. It may need participation. Completion often carries this invitation. Stop circling what has already taught you what it came to teach, and let the teaching become movement. Experience will often show you the difference through simplicity. Things become more direct. You say less before acting. You require less internal ceremony before making a clear choice. You stop needing every step to feel profound in order for it to be aligned. 7 often lowers the amount of drama required for truth to be lived. That reduction in drama can feel ordinary, but it is actually one of the signs that your system has stopped needing intensity in order to trust itself. And from there, implication deepens again. Because once a person can live without needing every lesson to arrive dramatically, they become more available for subtler forms of guidance. They can hear quieter signals. They can perceive earlier shifts. They can notice where life is leaning before life must push. This is one of the most beautiful consequences of completion. It does not make reality less demanding. It makes your participation in reality less wasteful. This is also why 777 is connected with wisdom rather than mere success. Success can happen accidentally, through force, through timing, through favorable conditions. Wisdom has to pass through recognition, consequence, and embodiment. Wisdom changes the observer, not only the outcome. It creates someone who can continue moving without recreating unnecessary friction just to feel alive or important. The wave completes, and because it completes, the one who remains after it is not merely relieved. They are reordered. That reordering is what allows the next layer of life to become visible. A completed cycle often reveals that what you thought was the whole lesson was only the first scale of it. Once you have enough coherence to stop repeating one pattern personally, you may begin to see the same pattern socially, collectively, or structurally. What was once private learning starts becoming wider perception. 777 therefore does not close your sight, it matures it. You may begin noticing that the same logic that governed your personal cycle also lives inside institutions, family systems, communities, and entire spiritual cultures. The same delays, the same compensations, the same loops of avoidance, the same hunger for closure without transformation. Completion in you makes these larger patterns more legible, not so you can become superior to them, but so you can stop unconsciously feeding them. This is another way the wave continues after it has settled. And perhaps this is where the deepest beauty of 777 begins to reveal itself. Completion does not harden into finality, it softens into availability. It makes more of you available to the present, more of your intelligence available to the next demand, more of your life available to what has not yet needed to emerge. That is why true mastery rarely feels like standing above the path. It feels more like walking it with less internal noise. So when 777 appears, it may not be asking you to celebrate an ending as much as notice a readiness. Notice what has become trustworthy in you. Notice what no longer needs to be negotiated every time it arises. Notice what your life can now hold without collapsing into an older pattern. And then notice, with equal care, what that new steadiness is quietly making possible that you could not yet have carried before.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.